Welcome to NCPTC's training on mandated reporting. I'm Amy Russell. I'm the staff attorney with the National Child Protection Training Center, and while we're going to talk about, try to talk generally about mandated reporting in all states, there are some instances where we're going to focus more on Minnesota. When this is broadcast, we're going to have information available to people for all the states, and so they'll have access to information on laws for all the states on where to report, with phone numbers of where to report. So we'll talk about that. But first, how common is child abuse? Why is this even important? Why are there rules that are out there for mandated reporting? Statistically, what we know right now is that 1 out of 3 girls, 1 out of 6 boys will be sexually abused by the time they reach the age of 18 in some way. 7 million children are victims of physical abuse every year, and 2,000 children die from abuse every year. And many fail to protect. There are laws out there that say that we have to report this abuse, but oftentimes physically abused children are known to a number of adults, but people just aren't reporting. And it's as much as 60% of mandated reporters who have an obligation, a legal obligation to report child abuse, are not doing it when they suspect child abuse. They're not reporting. A lot of times people think, I'm not going to report because it's not going to do any good. What's going to happen? How's that going to help anybody? It's only going to create some more problems. Mandated reporting laws have reduced child abuse deaths by 50% since they've been implemented. 66% of all substantiated child abuse cases come from mandated reporters, and so that's a huge number of folks that by law are reporting when they suspect abuse, and we're able to substantiate or support the fact that abuse is taking place. And child abuse rarely stops without intervention. There has to be somebody who recognizes the abuse and somebody who intervenes, somebody who makes some kind of an act to stop the cycle of violence. So what can you do to help? If you're here, you're interested in mandated reporting, or you may be a mandated reporter, so what can you do? How do you respond? Well, first of all, you have to have mandated reporter training. There are some states that actually require that you go through mandated reporter training. You have to have a certificate, and that will help you keep your license. For example, if you're an educator in Iowa, you have to go through the training to be able to maintain your education license. You also have to understand how kids disclose abuse. Kids aren't just going to run up and say, hey, guess what happened to me the other day? You have to understand that there are certain dynamics that they go through, and that there are ways that they may be reporting abuse to us. We also have to recognize behavior and physical signs, because not all kids are going to tell us when they've been physically or sexually abused or neglected. So we have to be able to recognize when there are red flags out there for kids, and be able to act upon those physical and behavioral signs. When parents are on the edge, when you're out in the grocery store, when you're seeing parents who are just really stressed out by their kids, we have to know how to intervene, how to help out, and those are circumstances where we might actually stop violence before it actually happens, if we know how to intervene and respond when parents are kind of out there and getting too stressed out and too frustrated. And we also need to let people know that we can prevent abuse. We need to be active in our communities as mandated reporters, educating other people, letting them know that there are ways that we can respond that will reduce the likelihood of abuse for kids. And we want to talk to our coworkers. It's not just the community, but it's the people with whom we work, and let them know, particularly if you're in a field where you're a mandated reporter, let your coworkers know that they're probably mandated reporters too, and so you need to educate your colleagues as well. Okay, this is just a quick overview of the child protection system, just so you have some general understanding of where this is coming from. The Child Abuse Protection and Treatment Act is a federal act that came down in 1974. That was the first federal action that said, hey, we need to be responding better to kids. We need to have mandated reporting laws. Because the federal government couldn't order states to all enact mandated reporting laws, they said, we'll give you money. This is how the federal government gets people to do things. They can't order states to enact laws, but they said, we'll make this money available to you if you enact different laws about child abuse. So the CAPTA law required states to develop systems to receive and screen reports for maltreatment. They had to set up some way about how to get these reports to come in. Because if abuse was happening, there wasn't a requirement that people reported it, and there wasn't a process for people to go about making those reports to somebody who could respond to that child. They had, the states then had to conduct investigations and make determinations. Was the abuse substantiated or not? Was it determined or not? That's a different kind of language that different states use. But basically they're saying yes, abuse occurred, or no, abuse didn't occur. And then they need to provide services and interventions to keep kids safe afterwards. So once we've identified them as potential victims and we've done our investigation, we have to make sure that after this we're going to keep them safe. And it was reauthorized in 2003. So that's just the background. This is where the states started with how we respond to child abuse. In the state of Minnesota, we have MSA, the Minnesota Statute 626556. All states have some form of child abuse reporting. And attached in the materials is information from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, mandated reporters in child abuse and neglect, the summary of state laws. And this really goes through and very briefly, it is a summary, very briefly talks about who's a mandated reporter, when you're required to report, what privileges there might be that might be exceptions to how you report. But because we can't cover all of the specific states in this training, we'll have this available for you. Okay. So in Minnesota, the Minnesota Reporting and Maltreatment of Minors Act establishes legal mandates and public policy stating there are some people who work with children who are required to report abuse. So they identified within our state, and all other states have some kind of identification of who's required to mandate. So in Minnesota, we allow for mandated and voluntary reporting of child abuse, and we want to protect kids once we've gotten those reports in. We're going to protect kids and strengthen families. If necessary, this act allows for children to go into placement. We try not to do that, but that's one consequence of a child being abused, is that they might go into placement. And then this act actually defines child abuse and neglect. So it helps people understand, if I'm reporting something, this is the definition that it has to meet to be able to go forward. So one of the things we need to understand is when I talk about maltreatment, I'm talking about multiple forms of abuse or neglect. And within the state of Minnesota, neglect was reported 64.7% of the times of all of the reports within the state in 2007. 64.7% were about neglect. That's obviously the highest of what we see for all kids. That's the most common, and people think that that's the most damaging for some kids is neglect for them. Physical abuse came in at 32.2%, sexual abuse in the state of Minnesota in 2007, 10.2%, and mental injury, which is sometimes called psychological abuse or psychological neglect, came in at 0.05%. It goes over 100 because sometimes kids experience multiple forms of abuse. And note, approximately 50% of referrals to child protection comes from schools and law enforcement officers. So that's a lot of folks who are making those reports, who are mandated reporters, where that's coming in. So we need to understand what our roles and responsibilities are. Generally, in the state of Minnesota, there were 54,000 reports to child protection. A third of those were screened in and 2/3 were screened out. So when you make a call goes into a screener. They make a determination as to whether there's enough information or it's a serious enough violation of the child's, it's a violation of the law against the child in terms of physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect, that they'll take some action to investigate that in some way. And in the state of Minnesota, we have a two-tiered response. We can either go into an investigative response or a family assessment response. There are, I believe, 12 states who now have those kind of alternative or differential responses. An investigation is kind of that full-fledged investigation that really digs into the family, gets the history of the child, is sometimes confrontational for families. A family assessment tends to be more cooperative with families. It tends to be more holistic in trying to identify what the concerns, the strengths, and the weaknesses of the family are, and then how do we build on those. The investigative reports or the investigative responses, those are the ones that will come out with some kind of a finding or a determination that abuse occurred or did not occur. In a family assessment, they don't have that kind of finding generally. They just make some kind of determination that maybe services are needed for this family or they're not, and then they proceed in that way, but there's not a determination. And this is from Minnesota, 2 reporters of child maltreatment from 2007. Just gives you, for those of you who like pie graphs and other visuals, gives you information about where those reports were coming from. So again, 27% from law enforcement or the courts, 23% from school personnel, and just gets less as it goes around. Social workers, health practitioners, parents, other anonymous, so just gives you a breakdown of who's making those reports. Okay, so mandated reporting. Let's talk about that. We're going to talk about who has to report, why it's important to report, when a report should be made, where it should be reported to, and what information do you need to have to make that report. So those are the things we're going to cover. And again, this is in Minnesota, that 66556 that talks about who the professionals are that are mandated to report. That varies by state, and it varies by whether you're actually acting in your professional capacity or not. So for example, in the state of Minnesota, we've got the professional or the professional's delegate. So what does that mean? If we've got somebody's delegate, what does that mean? Like if we've got mental health services, professional is normally the therapist. Who's their delegate?
One that answers the phone, or that might meet the child in the lobby or something?
Yeah, somebody that answers the phone, meets the child in the lobby. Any support staff that works with that professional, they're going to be a mandated reporter as well. Social services providers, child care providers. If you've got a child care provider and you've got some kids who are assisting, some teenagers or young adults who are assisting, they are the child care provider's professional delegate. So they all have to have this training. They all have to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Law enforcement, probation, correctional services. Clergy, there's some limitations on the clergy in many states on whether the disclosure to the clergy member about abuse is done in the act of a confessional form or if it's general counseling. And so there's some privileges and exceptions if it's as part of the confessional. So there's some exceptions there, and that takes place in a number of states. A member of the healing arts, education providers, and in the state of Minnesota, education providers, you can arguably include bus drivers. A lot of people say, well, what about bus drivers? Where are they included? How do they fit in? But if it's a delegate, if it's somebody who is employed by or who has responsibility as assigned by one of these professionals, then those folks too are mandated reporters. Hospital administration, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, counselors. Healing arts includes, of course, physicians, nurses, those kinds of folks. This is pretty similar. Most states include healing arts people, doctors, nurses, dentists, chiropractors. Most of them will include the medical practitioners. Most of them will also include social workers. There are a couple of states that say everybody is a mandated reporter. And if you're in one of those states, and that's in this list of the state summary laws, if you're in that state, then you are required, no matter what, if you suspect or have, if you believe or have reason to believe that a child is being abused, then you're a mandated reporter. Some states say that you are a mandated reporter, you're required to report abuse only when you come across that knowledge or that reason to believe when you're acting in your official capacity. So one of those states, I believe, is Illinois. When I was working in Illinois as a social worker, if I was in the grocery store and I saw a child being physically abused, legally I didn't have an obligation to make that report if I wasn't on my work time. Now we're going to talk about ethical responsibility versus legal responsibility, but legally, in terms of what I'm required to do, what I can be held liable for if I don't, there are distinctions for each state too. So you have to understand where you fit, what your state requires. Is it when you're acting in your professional role, or is it that by designation of your profession you are always a mandated reporter? The state of Minnesota doesn't say. In our law, it doesn't tell us whether it's when you're acting as a professional or if it's any time at all. And so there could be arguments made that I didn't have to report because I was in the grocery store and I wasn't working at that point. Again, we'll talk a little bit later about the ethical responsibility that follows up with that, but that's something to take into consideration as well. And all of the laws also allow for voluntary reporting. So even if you're not a mandated reporter, even if you don't fall into one of these categories, you can still always, in all states, report. You can call up whatever the agency is and say, I have some concerns, give them the necessary information, and make that report voluntarily. You're not required to do so. When you do report, you have to report physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect to a child when the reporter knows an incident or has reason to believe. And that's in all of the laws as well, that if you know about something or if you have reason to believe it or if you suspect. So you don't have to actually have proof that abuse has happened. It's just to that reason to believe. So if there's something suspicious that's going on that makes you think, I'm not really sure about this, your job as a mandated reporter isn't to complete that investigation and figure out if there's enough to report. You make your report with what information you have, and then CPS will make that determination whether they're going to screen it in or screen it out. And then in the state of Minnesota, it's limited to abuse or neglect within the preceding 3 years. All states don't have that kind of limitation. For some states, it's any time. If you know that a child has been abused at any point in their life, you have to report it. Minnesota is just for the past 3 years. So if it's happened 4 years ago in Minnesota, even as a mandated, even as a mandated reporter coming across this in my professional role, I'm not mandated to report that. Again, going back to the ethical obligations, you might need to report that ethically. All right. So, and this differs a little bit by state too, but in Minnesota, a report must be made immediately, and that means within 24 hours. So within 24 hours of you coming to think that a child has been abused, or you have reasonable suspicion that a child is being abused, you suspect it in some way, then within 24 hours you have to make an oral report. You have to call DCFS or DHS in our state and make that report that you suspect abuse. Then, as a mandated reporter, you're supposed to follow that up with a written report within 72 hours. That varies a little bit by state, and so you'll want to check out within your states what your requirements are. But for Minnesota, you have to make an oral report within 24 and a written report within 72. And then where to report, this might be a little bit difficult to see. And this again varies with the states, but within the state of Minnesota, there are different people who are responsible for investigating abuse. So for example, if it's maltreatment within the family unit, that call goes to the child welfare unit. The child welfare or child protective services only investigates those cases when it's intrafamilial abuse, or if it's somebody who abused the child who is in a position of supervision or care of that child. Otherwise, it might not go to the child welfare unit. If it's treatment outside of the family, then you want to call law enforcement. If it's abuse outside of the family, call law enforcement because they might have to investigate that. If it's within a licensed facility, like a daycare or an institution like a boarding school or a juvenile detention center, for example, then you should call the person who licenses that facility. And people don't always know who that is, and so if you have questions, you can always just call the local CPS and they'll redirect you. And again, why do we report? Because we want to prevent further harm to the child. We want to assist the families in receiving those needed services. If we want to disrupt or terminate that cycle of violence that's going on in the home. So if we intervene, then it might stop. And if you're a mandated reporter, it's required by law. So that's why we want to report. So when we're calling it in, when we're giving this call, what information do we need to have? A lot of people think that they need to, again, prove this. That's not the idea. Again, it's if you have reason to believe or reason to suspect that abuse is going on. So it's not your obligation to actually gather the evidence as a mandated reporter to prove it. If you know the name of the offender, you want to include that information. That's not always required. That can be found out through interviews with the child by the professionals, or it could be could be done with interviews with the parents. They might know who had access to the child. But if you know that information, report it. If you don't not make your report. You should still follow through. Name of the alleged victim, because they have to know who they're going to be responding to and talking to. You want the nature and extent of the maltreatment. That doesn't mean you have to gather all of the details of everything, but basically you want to know what happened. So what type of abuse are you suspecting? Is it sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect? And you don't even have to have it categorized in that way. It could be, there's this neighbor who was out playing with the other neighbor kid, and he was touching the kid in a way that was a little bit weird. I wasn't quite sure what it was. It looked like it was on such and such part of the child's body. So you make that report, you give them that information. Depending on how much information you can give about what you saw happen, then they can make that determination on whether it needs to be something that's investigated. So the nature and extent. What was it? What happened? What did you see? And then if you're a mandated reporter, in many states you have to give your own contact information. Not all states require that. But if you don't give that information, then they can't follow up with you. If you do give that information, you can ask to have some feedback, some follow-up with the CPS agency to find out what happened. They can tell you whether or not they accepted the report. They can tell you whether or not it went to the investigation or the family assessment. They can tell you if services were recommended. They're not going to tell you a lot of other information, but at least they'll give you some idea of what the response was. So once you make that report and you give them your contact information within the state of Minnesota, you'll receive notification within 10 days unless they think that giving you that information is not in the child's best interest. They'll again tell you whether it was screened in, whether it went to the investigation or the family assessment, and that will go to anybody who gives their name. So even if you're a voluntary reporter, you can get those pieces of information. You can get that notification. If you're a mandated reporter, you can also get who the social worker who was assigned to the case. You can get that person's name. You can get what the determination was, if there was a determination, so abuse occurred or did not occur, whether the case was open for services, and if there were any referrals that were made out. So these are things, if you do give information, give your contact information as a mandated reporter, then you can get some follow-up. You don't have to. You don't have to get that follow-up, but a lot of people do. They just want to know what's going on with this child. And then the voluntary reporters, too, will get just the statement whether services are provided. They're not going to get the social worker's name. They're not going to get, if there was a determination, they're not going to get that other stuff. Okay. And there are also consequences if you're a mandated reporter and you fail to report. There are consequences for that. So people say, yeah, I don't think that's really that big of a deal. I don't want to make that report. I'm just really not sure. I don't want to mess up the family. I don't want to ruin my relationship with this child. Whatever their excuse is, they say, I'm not going to report. Well, there are consequences. In the state of Minnesota, it's a misdemeanor. And so you could be held responsible for violating that misdemeanor. And if you do report and it turns out that it's not founded, it's not substantiated, there are protections for you that people can't come back on you. You have immunity if you're making a good faith report. If the report that you make is something that you've done because you actually had reason to believe that something was going on and it wasn't a malicious report, then you are protected as a mandated reporter, and somebody can't come back and sue you or follow up with any harmful, can't think of the word I'm looking for. You're immune from civil or criminal liability when that report is made in good faith. They can't retaliate against you. And that's true within school settings too. Commonly what happens in the school setting is if somebody wants to make a report, a lot of schools will say, well, you can't make this report on your own, you have to go up a certain chain. When I was working in schools, there was a situation where our vice principal said, nobody makes a mandated report but me. Whenever you suspect abuse, you have to come to me and make that report. That was not right. That was not legal. And so if I followed that chain of command and she didn't make the report, then I still had the liability for not reporting. If I didn't follow that chain of command that she had set forth, but I went through and made that report myself, then I'm protected by retaliation from that principal. She wouldn't be able to come back and say to me, you didn't follow the rules that we've set forth for mandated reporting, you're going to be punished. I was protected against that because they want people to report their suspected abuse, and they want the person with the first-hand knowledge to be able to do that. And the name of the reporter is confidential unless it's disclosed as part of the court process. So if you are a mandated reporter, the investigators can't go out and tell the family or the child who the person was that made that initial report. You're protected in that way. Any questions about any of this so far? I'm plowing through it. Okay. So let's talk about the different forms of abuse. So we'll start with physical abuse. And this is generally thought of the most kind of common one, but remember, neglect is actually the one that's most commonly reported. So a general definition, physical abuse is any non-accidental injury to a child under the age of 18 by a parent or caretaker. So it doesn't have, if it's somebody else who's physically abusing, then it's an assault. Actually, it's not physical abuse. So a non-accidental injury to a child under the age 18 by a parent or caretaker. So it could be somebody who even has, the mom's running to the store and she says to her boyfriend, can you watch my kid for 10 minutes, I'll be right back. That person is now a caretaker of the child and can be held responsible for physically abusing the child if he or she does so. Physical abuse can include physical injury, mental injury, dangerous actions, and threatened injury. We most often think of physical abuse as when people are spanking their kids or whooping them or beating them or making them do some physically demanding types of things. But there are other actions that are included in that. So it's the physical injury, the mental injury, dangerous actions, and threatened injury that leads to that physical abuse of a child. So it includes inflicted non-accidental physical injury. So it can't be that the child just fell down and hurt themselves. That's not physical abuse, right? Mental harm or threatened injury by a person responsible for a child's care. Actions done in anger without due regard for the safety of a child. If you've got a parent who is really angry and they go and slap their kid across the face as part of discipline, that could be deemed to be physical abuse. Physical or mental injury that cannot be reasonably explained by a child's history. So by a child's history is who's explaining it? The child, the parent, does it mesh? We need to figure that out. So asking the child what happened, asking the parents what happened, and does it just make sense? Does it physically, physiologically, medically make sense with that report? And an unauthorized aversive or deprivation procedures. I worked on a case once where the child was required their punishment. He was about 7 years old. He was required to hold his hands out with phone books on his hands and stand on one leg. That was his punishment. If he dropped the phone book or if he touched a leg down, and he would have to do this for hours at a time, he would get smacked down. He would have to stand up and he would have to start it all over again. Now there's a number of forms of abuse that's going on there. The physical smacking of him that knocked him to the ground and at times caused injuries or bleeding or other lasting scars for him. Those were all things that were physical abuse. But the holding up of the phone books, the standing on one leg, that's an aversive procedure. That's not normally thought of as a normal disciplinary act for kids, right? So we have to think about this in a little bit broader sense. It's not just hitting and spanking. the things that we have to take into consideration, at least in the state of Minnesota, and you'll have to follow up with this in your own states, is physical abuse does not include reasonable and moderate physical discipline not resulting in injury. So if somebody physically spanks their child, they employ physical discipline with kids through spanking, and they use their hand and not another object, and they don't leave marks, that's not physical abuse. It varies within the state that you're in if physical discipline is physical abuse or not. But in the state of Minnesota, if it's reasonable, if it doesn't leave marks, then it's not physical abuse. Reasonable restraint in schools. If a child has to be restrained because they're their behavior is out of control, they have to be held down, then that's not considered physical abuse. And any accidental injuries, unless there's some kind of physical discipline that's taking place that results in those accidental injuries. So if somebody is spanking their kid and knocks them down the stairs, and they didn't really mean to knock them down the stairs, but it could have been reasonably considered that if you're standing at the top of the stairs and you're spanking your kid really hard, it's reasonable to conceive that that child could fall down the stairs and injuries could result. And so that could fall under physical abuse as well, even though the spanking might not be physical abuse. Does that make sense? Signs of physical abuse that we want to pay attention to. If there are unexplained burns, bites, bruises, broken bones, black eyes. So what do I mean by unexplained? The child comes in, has a black eye, and he gives you some explanation. He gives you some reason why he's got a black eye, but it just doesn't make sense. That could be a sign of physical abuse. Does it really fit with that child's history report? Has fading bruises or other marks noticeable after an absence from school? So you've got a child who is gone for a couple of days from school, comes back and they've got bruises. What does that say to you?
Maybe they were punished over the weekend or beat up that day.
Yeah. So they were punished, they were gone for a couple of days, and now their bruises are fading. Maybe the parents went, oh crap, I went too far, right? And so now they've got to kind of keep the kid home, keep them protected. Maybe the child has long sleeves on, long pants on when the weather doesn't seem like that's appropriate attire. Those are the kinds of things we want to think about. Seems frightened of the parents or protests or cries when it's time to go home. And it might not even be protesting or crying. It could be kids who become really super involved in after-school activities and just hang out at school as long as they can because they just don't want to go home. They know that it's safe at school. I'm going to stay there. I'm going to become involved in all of these activities, do all of these functions, participate in as much as I can, because if I'm busy here, I'm not getting beat there. So we want to pay attention to that. Shrinks at the approach of adults. I know you've probably all seen animals. There are certain animals who've been abused where you raise your hand and they kind of shy away. There are some kids who will respond like that too, so you need to pay attention to that. And, hey, here's one. Reports injury. This is a big one, right? If a child actually verbally says, hey, somebody's been hitting me, by somebody who's a parent or somebody else who's in a position of authority, power, or giving care to that child, we need to listen. We need to hear that, and we need to make a report. Other signs of physical abuse, we have to consider this when the caregiver offers conflicting, unconvincing, or no explanation. So the child comes to school and they have a bruise on their eye, or a black eye, and you ask the parent, and the parent says, oh yeah, well he fell down the stairs and hit his eye. Well, so think about falling down the stairs. How will that, where's the bruise on the child? Does it really match? If you're falling down the stair, are you likely to get a black eye? You have to think about, does it fit? Describes a child as evil or in some other negative way. They say, this kid is just a horrible kid. I actually was getting a pedicure a couple of weeks ago, and this woman, while she was giving me a pedicure, I won't say where I went, told me how horrible her child was. She literally said to me, you know, I tried for years and years to keep this child off of meds because I thought that that was the better way to go. But he's just a bastard child. He's so bad that I just couldn't control him. I should have drugged him up years ago. I'm like, hello, child protection. You might want to come and take a look at this woman. I mean, it was just the most bizarre thing that she was saying. But, you know, if you've got a woman who's standing there telling you that she should have drugged her child up years ago, that might be a red flag for you, right, to make some kind of a report. Uses harsh physical discipline with the child. I always think that if I see somebody spanking their kid in public, what are they doing to the child at home? I always wonder that. Because if they think that form of discipline is okay for everybody else to see, I always have to imagine that whatever else is going on at home is going to be 10 times worse. So I actually have followed people out of grocery stores before and written down their license plate numbers and called the police. If I thought that it was too dangerous to intervene right then and there, that the child would get in more trouble once they got home, I would follow them out surreptitiously, write down the license plate, and call the police or child protection. Because, again, if they're doing that in public, what are they doing at home? And if that person has a history of abuse as a child, if that's something that you know about, then that kind of raises the risk level for the child that they're going to be abused. So if you've got a parent who has a history, then that might be a red flag. Now, that's not enough to call child protection on, but it's something just to consider when you're thinking about all of the other things that might be going on. Okay, questions about any of those? Okay. The other thing that we have to consider with physical abuse is kids do injure themselves, right? When they fall down, where do they fall?
Knees, elbows.
Knees, elbows, chins, sometimes, maybe foreheads, right? If they fall backwards, they fall on their butt. They usually don't fall like on the middle of their backs. They usually don't fall on their legs, the back of their thighs, on the front of their shins, unless they're racking it on something, which I've done before. But so you have to think about where they're falling. They're gonna have like forward falling motion, backward falling motion. We have to think about that. So scrapes, bruises, those kinds of things on those parts of their bodies, not really concerning. And some kids are more clumsy than others. We have to consider that as well. But when we see those injuries to the back, the inner thigh, genitals, then we're not likely to see the genital injuries if we're mandated reporters. But if you're providing care in a daycare, maybe you're changing diapers for kids, you might see something like that. Behind the ear injuries, oftentimes resulting from a child being grabbed by the ear and pulled. That's common for kids. Those are suspicious injuries. Those are things that we want to pay attention to. Do you guys know what cauliflower ear is? Mm-hmm. Wrestlers? Yeah, what do they get it from?
They rub it on the mat.
Yeah. It's the rub it on the mat. It's that kind of friction that's going on. There are some kids who get cauliflower ear from being hit and grabbed and pushed down on the ground and things. When you see little kids have that, you know, okay, are they in wrestling class? That's one thing, but that's not a common injury for a child to have, so you have to pay attention to that. Pockets of missing hair. What does that result from?
Pulling.
Yeah, pulling, grabbing the hair and pulling. So what we want to know is, does the explanation of the injury make sense? What the child tells us, what the caregiver tells us, what the non-offending parent tells us, does it make sense? Is it rational? Is it reasonable? If you've got a child who said, oh, I tumbled down the stairs, but they've got linear injuries on their legs, it doesn't really match up with a fall down the stairs, so you want to pay attention to that. Is there an unusual and consistent pattern? That's that linear injury that I was talking about. I have a couple of pictures that I'll show you, so I just want to warn you ahead of time that they're not very pleasant to look at, but there's just two. But is there a pattern? If there's an injury with a pattern, what made that pattern? We have to think about that. This one, this is a child's leg, and you can see here's a pattern here. What does that look like?
Fingernails.
What?
Fingernails or?
Nope, because it's too big. So it can't be fingernails.
Cord or?
Yeah, A cord, it could be, in this case, I think it was an extension cord. But there are other cases where a similar pattern looks like this with the end of a fly swatter, not with the swatting side, but with the metal round bit. Sometimes could look like that. Sometimes, if it's with a belt, the end of a belt, it could look like that. So if there's any kind of a pattern to it, then it's abuse with a weapon, basically. I mean, there's some kind of instrument that's involved that caused that pattern. I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's these dots that are here. Can you see them?
Mm-hmm.
What might cause something like that?
Hairbrush?
A hairbrush. Yeah, the child was hit on the top of the head with a hairbrush. So you want to pay attention to if there's any patterns that we see with kids. Those pattern injuries are abusive acts. Bruises on the buttocks indicate a lot of force. There's a lot of padding there. Some of us have more padding than others. But if you've got a bruise on your butt, that requires a lot of force to do that. And when you can see handprints on kids, whether it's their face, their arms, or their buttocks, because you actually see red where it would be in between the fingers, because that's where the blood pools, because on the pads of your fingers, that's where the force is. So it pushes the blood out, and so it makes the lines. And so if you can see kind of the finger marks when somebody's hit, that takes a lot of force, not as much on your face, but a lot to leave a mark like that on the butt. Bruises aren't always easy to detect, particularly if you have a child who has dark complexion, and there are sometimes, there's a disease called Mongolian spots, which actually look sometimes like physical abuse. They look like bruises. And so there are oftentimes people who, if their children have Mongolian spots, they carry around a letter from their physician that say, Mongolian spots, my kid has Mongolian spots. But it sometimes looks like it's a bruise. And so in those situations, again, if you ask about what happened and the response from somebody doesn't seem to make sense, you still want to make that report. A lot of people don't know what Mongolian spots are, and they don't think that that's real, so they'll make a report on that. But just, there's some things that you need to be aware of. But thinking about bruises, they come in varying ages sometimes, and they look different depending on the age. If there are varying ages of bruises, like when you first get a bruise, it doesn't show up quite so much, and then a couple days later, it's like that green and purple kind of a color, and then it fades out, fades out, fades out. If there are those varying degrees of bruises on kids, that's very concerning because it seems to be a pattern of abuse for that child. If there are injuries on the head, the genitals, stomach, vital organs, and the vital organs could be from punches in the stomach that might happen, slaps on the head, could be knocking the child down to the ground where they're hitting their head. I was in a trial one time and a doctor was testifying, and they asked, she was testifying about the injuries that the child had received, and there was some severe bruising on the child's head. And the attorney asked, well, is that serious? And she said, well, it holds the brain, so yeah, it's pretty serious. So you have to think about vital organs. You know, if you're punching a child in the stomach hard enough to be bruising and injuring an organ, think of the force that has to be involved in that. Objects are more dangerous than an open hand. There are some states that physically state you can slap a child with an open hand, but not with a fist. So you need to be aware of what your laws are for there. But if you're hitting somebody with an open hand, then the force is diffused. If you're using a fist, it's more powerful. And if you're using some kind of an object, that gives you even more force when you're swinging than just with your open hand or a fist. So we need to know if the child can tell us, was there an object used? And sometimes we can figure that out by the markings that's left on the child. And again, traditional spanking on the buttocks with an open hand that does not cause injury is not a crime, and it's not a child maltreatment issue. It's just that traditional spanking. However, people do, this is a controversial issue, and not everybody agrees. There are some studies out there that support that there are some risks to physically abusing or physically disciplining a child. Spankers are more likely to use other forms of corporal punishment. So even if you're spanking, there might be other forms of physical discipline that they're using in addition to the spanking. Aversive discipline is more likely when a parent is angry, depressed, fatigued, or stressed. So when you're in these highly emoted states, then you're more likely to use some kind of physical discipline or other aversive discipline. And there was a study that was done in Minnesota. 1,003 Minnesota moms responded that 44% of them responded that they had lost it when they were spanking their kids. That's when they most often did it. So when are they doing it? When they're angry, right? And are they likely to kind of mediate the force that they're using with the child? Oftentimes people will not put all of their force into it because they're just trying to teach the child a lesson, right? But if you're angry, it's difficult for you to kind of stop that. Your emotions kind of take over, so you have to be aware of that as well. All right. Questions about physical abuse? So we're going to move on to sexual abuse. Again, not when we're talking about statistically how much of this happens that's reported. Those are two. There's a couple of different issues that we have to think about. Initially, I gave you statistics that 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys will experience sexual abuse at some point in their life before they reach the age of 18. But it was one of the lower reported. It was about 10%, I think, when we were looking at the statistics in terms of maltreatment reports. So what does that tell us? That perhaps not all of these are being reported, right? This is a highly underreported form of abuse for kids. Sexual abuse is the subjection of a child to criminal sexual act or threatened act by a person responsible for the child's care or by a person who has a significant relationship to the child or is in a position of authority. There is sexual abuse by other people. That's not a person in a position of authority, but that doesn't fit under the mandated reporting acts oftentimes, or it falls under a different category. And so that's why when we're talking about somebody with a significant relationship or is in a position of authority, that's one aspect of it. But there are other aspects of the reporting laws that say if you suspect that a child is being abused by anybody, then you should be reporting that. So this is that definition that's kind of a general definition under the child abuse statutes and not the criminal statutes. Sexual abuse includes abuse by a person of a position of authority. We just talked about that. And it's no matter how brief. Again, it could be that guy who's watching the boyfriend who's watching the kids when the mom runs out to get a jug of milk or something. Person responsible for a child's care inside the family unit. That should say unit. And it's anybody with child care responsibilities, again, no matter how brief. Yep.
Would that include like an older sibling if they were under the age of 18 or?
Yes. Depending on how old that child was and whether the parent put that person and said, watch your little brother or little sister. There are, in the state of Minnesota, there are guidelines as to when a child can be responsible for another child's care. Not all states have that. But if they are older and you could reasonably expect that child would be responsible for the younger one, and the parent says, I'm going to the store, watch your little brother or sister, then yes, it could be that person. Person responsible for the child's care outside the family unit, which includes school, daycare, employees, coaches. When I teach a 301 class here, a CAS 301 Child Advocacy Studies, it's a first course in our Child Advocacy Studies program. On my first day of class, I asked them how many of them had worked with kids in the past in some capacity, and almost all of them raised their hand. And they were either coaches' assistants, they were nannies, they were daycare providers, they worked in a daycare home, something. They worked in a after-school program or a summer camp or something. Then I asked them how many of them thought that they were mandated reporters. And about 3 of them raised their hands out of a class of 40. They just don't know. They don't understand that when they're in that position of responsibility over a child, that they are mandated reporters and they have to make those reports if they suspect abuse. So when I was talking about it's important for us to talk to people that we work with, we have to educate folks that we work with that they might be mandated reporters if they fall into those categories as a professional or a delegate. And a person with a significant relationship to a child related by blood, marriage, or adoption. The criminal sexual conduct, now that's actually the criminal statute, the criminal law, and it includes penetration. And this is, however, slight in terms of the penetration of a child. And it also includes sexual contact, touching of a child's intimate parts, having a child touch the other person's parts. And the degree, you can have criminal sexual conduct first, second, third, fourth degree. That depends on aggravating factors like the use of force, the infliction of harm, how young the child might have been, the age difference between the child victim and the alleged perpetrator or the actor, and the vulnerability of the child. So if the child has certain disabilities that make them more vulnerable to abuse by somebody else, then that also could increase the degree of criminal sexual conduct. Child sex abuse also includes violation of prostitution laws, which makes sense, right? Involving a child in sexual performance, and that's having them do movies or film pictures or something for you. Threatened sexual abuse includes unsupervised exposure to untreated sex offenders. This is an important one. What does that mean? How does that fit in with what we do? You do community notification. So if you've got somebody who says, I've got this friend of mine who's a registered sex offender, I think he's been treated, I think he's just fine, I leave him with my kid all the time. It's a report, yeah. That is a threat of sexual abuse. You've got a known sex offender, registered sex offender, who's there, and the person willingly allows that, the parent willingly allows that person to have contact with that child. That's a reportable act. Purposely exposing parts to a child, you think of the general flasher with the trench coat that walks around. It doesn't happen all that often, but that fits in there. Purposefully walking in on a child bathing or dressing. Now we have to think about how does this fit in. It makes sense if you've got a parent who's going to walk in on a child who's maybe 3-4 years old when they're dressing, right? Depends on kind of how often they do it and what they do when they go in there. But if you've got a parent who's walking in on a 13-14-year-old while they're dressing or bathing, that's a little bit more creepy, right? That's the kind of thing that you kind of want to go, I just don't think that's quite right. And then peeping on a child, of course, and you hear about that sometimes, like people drilling holes in walls in schools and hotels and things like that, so we need to pay attention to that too. Child sex abuse may also include attempting to engage a child in sexual activity by solicitation, request, or force. What does that sound like? Prostitution, yep. And it might be not as nefarious as prostitution. Is that a word? Nefarious as prostitution. It could be not as explicit in that way. If I'm going to give you money, it could be some other kind of, I'll give you gifts, I'll give you whatever. It could be force, but it could be done in a way that the child oftentimes may perceive themselves as the actor, or that they're getting some benefit from it because they're getting a gift or some kind of compensation or a trip or special favors or privileges. But we have to think about what is this person giving to the child, which might increase the responsibility on that other actor. Unexplained injuries to the genitals, suspicious of sexual abuse. For younger kids, sometimes there'll be bite marks on penises, other injuries around the genital area. You want to pay attention to those kinds of things if for some reason you see that. Purposely exposing a child to sexual activity. Some people say, you know what, I have every right to watch pornography in my home. I can pull out these films and it's great, and I do whatever in my home. I have this right. Well, you have to do it in privacy. So if you have kids, it's not like you can sit out in your living room and watch pornography because the kids might be walking in. But that's something when we're doing investigations we want to explore in terms of how was this child, if this child was exposed to pornography, how did it happen? As mandated reporters, that's not what you need to know. That's not what you need to find out, because those are the kind of details that the investigators will get. But if you have reason to believe that the child has been exposed, you make that report, and then the investigators will determine if it was kind of an accidental walking in. The child walked into mom and dad's bedroom while they were having sex or watching movies together or something, and they're like, get out, you know. That's different than, hey, little boy, come and sit next to me, right? So you have to, as investigators, make that distinction, but as mandated reporters, you don't. And if the child is diagnosed with sexually transmitted diseases, there are certain diseases that can only be transmitted through sexual contact, and that's where your medical professionals will come in. But if you know that a child has a sexual disease, you don't have to call a medical professional and say, hey, I have this child who has this STD, how is it transmitted? That's not your role. If you know a child has an STD, then call, make that report, and the investigators will follow up. So when we're talking about sexual abuse, there are three components that we want to consider, particularly when we're looking at a medical evaluation of a child. So we want to look at the history or the child's statement. What do we know up until now about the child, about this child and their experiences, and what does the child tell us about what happened? We're also going to pay attention behaviorally to the child. How do they interact with us and other people? And that physical examination. Now, for a medical provider, neither the physical examination nor behavioral indicators should stand on their own. They only support the child's report. So if we see behavioral indicators of a child who may have been sexually abused, again, we can ask the child about what we see, and then we can make a report about that. We don't have to figure out everything else. Some signs of sexual abuse, these are things that when we see these behaviors or see these emotional responses that we need to pay attention to. We want to consider the possibility of sex abuse. If they have difficulty walking or sitting, suddenly refuse to change for gym, participate in physical activities because they might be kind of trying to protect their body, they might not want physical contact with other people, nightmares or bedwetting. And particularly if you've got a child who maybe used to have nightmares and now they don't anymore, or they used to bedwet and now they don't anymore, and now these things are reoccurring for the child, those are indicators when there's any kind of regression or reoccurrence of things from previous years. Those are things that you might want to consider something has triggered this change for the child. Sudden change in appetite, and it could be not eating at all, and it could be snarfing down whatever they can get. Bizarre, sophisticated, unusual sexual knowledge or behavior. Now this is where it's helpful for us to have some understanding of normative sexual behavior, right? There are some things that kids will do that is a normal part of their sexual development. There are some things that we can expect kids at different ages to engage in, but we have to understand that there are some things that are not normal sexual acting out, or that is sexual acting out. It's not normal sexual behavior, so we have to pay attention to that. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Pregnancy or venereal disease or STDs if under age 14. I think even if they're over 14, you might want to consider that. If they continually run away. Now these aren't definitive markers. These are all signs where we have to think, oh, something might be going on. Let me pay attention a little bit more to the child. Let me talk to the child and find out. And then if the child, again, reports sexual abuse. If a child comes up to you and says, hey, guess what? I'm being sexually abused by so-and-so. You don't conduct your own investigation. You don't question what the child is saying to you. You'd say, thank you for telling me that information. There are other people that I have to talk to. We'll talk about the process of how we go through that too. But if a child verbally reports it to you, that's something that you really have to consider. Consider the possibilities of sexual abuse when the parent or other caregiver is unduly protective. Do they not let the kids go out anywhere, particularly if it's like a normal age development kind of a thing? If you've got a 13, 14-year-old, all of their friends are going out on group activities to go bowling, and the parent's like, nope, you can't go anywhere, you go to school and you come home. That kind of overprotectiveness sometimes can be indicative of sexual abuse. severe limits on the child's contact with other people. A lot of times there are concerns when kids are homeschooled. And that's not to say that all kids who are homeschooled are sexually abused, but there are concerns because that's a very limiting way. A lot of times homeschool programs will allow kids to go to other homeschool programs for different types of education or training, different subjects that they go for, because maybe one home is better at teaching trigonometry than another. But if they're completely isolated, then that's kind of a red flag for us. The child themselves is secretive and isolates themselves. That's something that we want to pay attention to. If the parent themselves is secretive and isolated. And if they're controlling or jealous with other family members, those are the other things that we want to pay attention to. That might be a sign of sexual abuse. Now, I talked about understanding normal sexual behavior. So we'll talk about what might be considered abnormal sexual behavior. When a child places their mouth on another child's part, and I'm talking about like 7 and under, this is not a normal sexual behavior. This is not something that they would normally learn and pick up through normal sexual development. If they ask others to engage in sex acts, particularly young, like little boys, sorry, our only male in the room, little boys who are 3 years old, maybe masturbating when they go to sleep, not so concerning because it's kind of just soothing for some kids. But when kids start masturbating with an object, you have to think that there's some way that they learn this other than normal sexual development. Inserting objects inside themselves is also a concerning behavior. Imitating intercourse. When they get to this point, they've had some kind of exposure to some form of sexual abuse, whether it's accidental disclosure, like they walked in on somebody, whether it's purposeful accidental exposure, not disclosure, purposeful exposure by somebody else, or it could be that they were forced to engage in sexual activities. And there could be a number of reasons why they might be doing that. We as mandated reporters don't have to suss out all that information. If we see that kind of behavior, that's the behavior that we want to report on. Making sexual sounds. Now, it would be fun if we just all had a sexual sound that we make right now, right? No, we're not going to do that. But that's the kind of thing, if you hear something that you're kind of like, what is that? Tell me about that. Where did you hear that sound before? I always was concerned when I heard kids doing the bum, 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 bow, bow, that kind of music, because I always affiliate that with pornography, those kinds of movies. That's always what I always think of. But apparently they're doing that on like SpongeBob now, and I'm so confused. I don't understand. So that's something that I need to educate myself on a little bit more. But when they're making these sexual sounds, sexual noises, we want to pay attention to that and ask them about it. French kissing, little pecks and kisses from kids is not normal. When they start using their tongues, that becomes concerning for us. If they attempt to undress other people, and particularly if they continue to try to undress other people when they've been told not to do that, if they've been reprimanded and scolded, and they continue to, that's concerning. If they ask to watch sexually explicit television, that's concerning. Now, this could be an issue because they have older siblings who watch it all the time, but again, as a mandated reporter, if we get this kind of information, we're not the ones who have to investigate that. We just have to report it. Other people will make that determination once we report. Imitating sexual behaviors with dolls, I also mentioned. So we have to pay attention to these kinds of things. Any questions about the sexual abuse definitions and examples? Okay, so we're going to go on to neglect. And neglect is the chronic failure of a parent or caretaker to provide a child under 18 with basic needs such as food, clothing, shelter, medical care, educational opportunities, protection, and supervision. That's a pretty broad definition. I mean, that can help us understand why that's the majority of the reports that we get, because it's a pretty broad definition. So it's a failure to provide basic care when reasonably able to do so. If you've got somebody who's unable to provide certain types of care, then that's a different story. And so maybe the assistance that family needs is not intervention with the child welfare system, but maybe with some other kind of financial assistance programs. And so we need to just pay attention to that. Failure to protect a child from conditions or actions that seriously endanger the child. So if we've got an unsafe or unreliable caretaker, somebody who's been proven to be or who has demonstrated that they're not okay to watch this child, that might be an older sibling who just is put in charge by the parent and then doesn't pay attention to the child for the next 3 hours while the parent is gone. That's a person where the parents cannot continue to put that person in the responsibility of care for a child. Involving a child in criminal act that seriously endangers the child, ongoing abuse between siblings. So you've got two siblings who are physically duking it out all the time. The parents can be held responsible for not ensuring the safety of those siblings. And a DUI with a child in the vehicle, if that person who's driving, who has a DUI, is responsible for the child's care. Other examples of neglect, medical neglect, if it substantially endangers the child's health. Now, depending on your state, there are some exceptions in terms of how somebody can respond medically, whether there are religious exceptions or otherwise. So you have to become a little bit more familiar with your state laws in terms of how that fits in. But it has to substantially endanger the child's health. Prenatal exposure to controlled substances and alcohol. And this varies hugely state by state. There are some states where, I'm sorry, there's no harm to a child yet if the child hasn't been born. So they have to wait until the child is born. Even if they know the mom is using cocaine throughout her pregnancy, there are some states where they have to wait until that child is actually born before they can act, because there's not a person who's been harmed. And then supervision, failure to provide necessary supervision or child care arrangements. And that's kind of that traditional just leaving your kid at home alone when they're not old enough to be on their own. And within the state of Minnesota, they do give us guidelines in terms of supervision. Leaving a child alone when they're under 8 should not be done. And this depends on their developmental level, kind of their social skills, how mature they are, how well do they react under stress. Those are kind of factors that mediate this a little bit. But generally, if a child is 8 to 10, 3 years, and then when they get 16 to 17 years old, they can be over 24 hours if there's an emergency plan in place, if they know who to call. So that's just a guideline that the state of Minnesota gives us. And then babysitting, they give us that too. Children under 11 should not provide care, although it's unlikely that somebody's going to swoop in from child protection when you've got a 10-year-old who's babysitting somebody else, particularly if they're responsible. There are some kids who are really responsible babysitters when they're 9, 10 years old. It depends on what other support is available to them. If they have, maybe there's a neighbor right across the hall that they know that they can go to if there's a problem. Those are all things that you can take into consideration. Excuse me. And then I said this, the modifying factors: age, vulnerability, maturity, disability. Other forms of neglect include educational neglect in the state of Minnesota, 7 days of unexcused absences if the child is 7 to 18. That's when they're required to be in school by our state law. Food and clothing, these are, if it's results in growth delay. So there has to be, the neglect actually has to result in some kind of harm or injury to the child. If it's food, and serious endangerment resulting from lack of clothing. So if they're going out in 20 below weather with flip-flops and shorts, and their parent is trying to clothe them. There are some kids who are going to take it all off, because they want to be defiant or something. But if the parent is trying to clothe them, that's one thing. If they're being sent out like that, that's another. So we have to pay attention to that as well. And then dangerous living conditions. Now this could include living in a car, right? I mean, there are some times when living in a car, we have to be careful with our kind of judgmental attitudes in terms of where child protection lands. But if you've got a family who's living in a car that has no heat, that doesn't run so they can't even make it warm in there, that's kind of, if you're living in Minnesota in the winter, that's a dangerous living condition. In the summertime, maybe not so much. And so it's kind of some of those other factors that you have to get in there too, and kind of get rid of some of our biases about how we think people should live. The other thing about dangerous living conditions here could also include if there are health risks to the child. If the house is so dirty, so dangerous, it doesn't mean that the house has to have running water or a toilet, but if there's no toilet facilities at all and people are just going wherever, obviously that's a problem. Or if they're living like in a meth house. If there's meth that's being cooked in the house or other forms of drugs and paraphernalia that's going on in that house, that could result in danger to a child. So that's a neglectful situation as well. All right. Signs of neglect, things that we want to look for in the child, possibly if they're frequently absent, if they're begging or stealing for money or food from other kids, they lack dental or medical care, immunization, glasses. A lot of schools now will have programs that will help out with that. So we have to just see what we can do to support kids in that way, but are they just coming without all of this? Are they consistently dirty, have severe body odor? And again, kind of have to put our judgments on hold and figure out, is this an issue where the child is just unclean, or are they like dangerously dirty? That's what we want to pay attention to. Abuses alcohol or other drugs, or says nobody's home to take care of them. Those are all indicators for us that a child might be being neglected. If a parent appears to be indifferent to a child, that's something else that we want to pay attention to. If they are apathetic and don't care, or think, oh, like he's old enough, he can fend for himself. I did cook my own food when I was 6 years old. He can cook his own food on his own. Those are things that we want to pay attention to. Behaves irrationally or bizarre. That could be a mental health issue that creates a neglectful situation for a child. Or the parent is abusing alcohol or other drugs and they're not able to adequately provide care for a child. Those are things that we want to pay attention to. Any questions about neglect? Psychological abuse, also called mental injury, is really, it's very difficult to prove, very, very difficult to prove. But it oftentimes goes along with sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. They oftentimes will go hand in hand. A mental injury is harm to a child's psychological capacity or emotional stability, evidenced by observable and substantial impairment. So when we get down to this, this is why it's really hard to prove this. You can have a parent who's really cruel and mean to a child, but if the child is kind of a resilient child and it doesn't result in substantial and observable impairment in the child's functioning, it's not going to rise to that level of mental injury for a child. That's why it's so hard to prove. So people usually will fall back on other forms of abuse to prove it. Because it goes along with other forms so frequently, they go to the other form of abuse because it's easier to support. If we suspect mental injury, though, that doesn't mean don't report it. So as a mandated reporter, if you see a parent who's reacting in certain ways or a child who's reacting in certain ways, we still should report that. So we want to consider maltreatment when there's a lack of attachment between an infant and a parent. Oftentimes you'll see if a parent puts a child down and walks away, the child will cry for that parent. The parent will pick them up and the child is comforted. If there's not that kind of bonding or attachment between the child and the parent, that's concerning for us because that might demonstrate that that person doesn't meet the emotional needs of that child. Lack of responsiveness to the environment. If you've got a kid who just doesn't like pick up on other people smiling and laughing or noises or other sights and sounds, they might just be kind of tuned out to things because of what their experiences have been. That's a concern for us. Failure to thrive. Do you guys know what failure to thrive is? You do. Why don't you tell us?
Generally when they're little and they weren't given enough nutrition and their bodies show it.
Yeah. I think the technical definition, and I could be corrected on this, is if they're at like the bottom 5 or 10% of the expectation, the growth expectations for kids. And yeah, they can really, and they can look like they're just skin and bones. Those pictures that you sometimes see of help Sally feed the children, you know, when the kids, they have their distended tummies and they're just so small, that's a failure to thrive. And then we also want to look for a parent who's highly critical or negative toward that child. And this again is one of those difficult things to kind of put your finger on because parents will criticize their child, but if they're saying, you are so stupid, you're just such an idiot, you never do anything right, those are things that we really need to start paying attention to. When the child shows extreme behaviors, overly compliant or demanding behavior, extreme passivity, extreme aggression, those are things that we want to pay attention to where they may have been emotionally maltreated. Now again, these kinds of behaviors might be indicative of other forms of maltreatment that they've experienced. And again, that's why sometimes we go the route and go for the other sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, instead of trying to prove the emotional. Either inappropriately adult, so they're parenting other kids at an inappropriate age, or inappropriately infantile. We want to pay attention to that. Do they behave socially where we would expect them to behave based on their age and their mental development? We want to pay attention to that. Is the child delayed in physical or emotional development, if they've attempted suicide, or if they lack attachment to the parent? Not just an infant, but an older child as well, lacking any kind of attachment, doesn't care when the parent leaves. We also want to consider the possibility of emotional maltreatment when the parent or the caregiver constantly blames, belittles, berates a child, unconcerned about the child, refuses to offer help for the child's problems. I have this child who's needs some kind of medical treatment, but I'm not going to be the one to follow through with that. That could fall under emotional maltreatment, but more likely they're going to go for neglect, that might be a medical neglect situation because that's a little bit easier to prove. And overtly rejects the child. Here's some examples of psychological abuse that you could see. And I'm not going to go into depth in these because I really want to get onto the next section. But there's some examples of kind of the maltreatment type that falls under psychological or mental injury, and then the description of how that might be exemplified. So you can read those on your own. So, what do we do when we have some suspicion that a child is being maltreated? How do we deal with that information? Where do we go? First of all, we have to understand, this is something I said earlier, how kids experience their abuse. And for sexual abuse, the Child Sex Abuse Accommodation Syndrome often helps us understand that information. Secrecy, how does secrecy happen in sexual abuse cases? How does that come up?
It happens in the privacy of the home, and you're told not to tell.
Yeah. It's not, sex abuse doesn't happen out in the middle of the playground usually where a bunch of other kids are around, right? Because the abuser wants to be able to continue that abuse. So it happens in private locations, secrecy of the home, and as you said, a lot of kids are actually threatened not to say anything to anybody. If you tell somebody, I'm going to kill you, if you tell somebody I'm going to kill your dog, I'm going to beat you, I'm going to beat your brother, I'm going to beat your mother, whatever. So there are threats. But then there are also bribes or inducements that kids get to keep that secret. If you tell anybody about this, I'm not going to be able to see you anymore. We're not going to be able to have this fun anymore. So those are some things as well that might make a child keep that secret. Helplessness. What about helplessness? How is a child helpless in our society?
They rely on adults to provide for them.
Yeah, they rely on adults to provide for them. So, and if we think about who's most commonly the abuser, the perpetrator of abuse, sexual, physical, and neglect, who's most commonly the perpetrator?
Caregiver.
A caregiver, yeah. So this is somebody who's responsible for taking care of the child, meeting their needs, and now the child is being abused by them. They're helpless to stop the abuse because they really can't say no to this person, so it continues on. They become trapped in the situation. If they can't say no, they didn't say no the first time, they might think, I can't say no the next time it happened, or I should have made it stop the first time and now there's nothing I can do to make it stop. So they become trapped in that situation and they learn to accommodate to it because they don't know how to get out of it. And they might learn to accommodate to it by the different behavioral things that we talked about earlier, right? They could become, they could act out, they could become defiant, they could lose skills that they had mastered before, bedwetting, other kinds of things. These are ways that kids might accommodate to abuse. They might also become those overachievers, and they might become those kids who kind of drop out of everything. So we have to pay attention to that. And then when they do report to us, we need to understand what they're telling us. It could be that it happens years later, right? Or they report their abuse years later. People oftentimes expect that as soon as a child gets abused, they're going to run out the door and tell somebody. And that's not how it works, particularly if you've got a person who is abusing the child who's in that position of power and authority over them. Because they didn't know how to say no, they didn't know how to tell, they didn't know how to make anybody else understand or believe them, so they might delay their disclosure. Or their report might be unconvincing to people because they might give little bits of information that don't maybe quite seem to make sense, or they'll tell one person one thing and one person another thing, and it's kind of inconsistent sounding, but they're trying to feel you out. They're trying to figure out how you respond, and if you freak out, then they're not going to tell you. So we have to be careful that when a child does tell us about their abuse experiences or their maltreatment, that we don't express any kind of shame, horror, disbelief in what they're saying. If you've got a person who's in a position of authority in a community, if you've got a pastor or a coach that's very well liked, or a Cub Scout troop leader or something that people think, oh, this is this pillar of our community, they're wonderful, and a child tries to tell somebody, people might say to that child, oh, why are you saying such a thing? You're just trying to get him in trouble. I don't believe that. He's such a wonderful person. What does the child do with that next? So we have to be willing to hear whatever the child says. And then if we do react in those ways, if we do say, oh, I don't believe you, I don't believe that person could do it, oh, you must have misunderstood, the child could retract or recant their statement. If we react with embarrassment or shame, they could say, oh, I was just kidding, that didn't really happen. So we have to be careful about how we respond once a child tells us, because we don't want them to retract or recant their statement. Okay, so that just helps us understand the child's abuse experience. And so when a child may report their abuse or victimization to us, we have to understand that those reports could come through in their behaviors. And we talked about those behaviors, those indicators of possible abuse. So that might be one thing. Their emotions, how are they interacting with people emotionally? Are they really withdrawn? Do they demonstrate those psychological problems that we discussed earlier? And then we need to think about their language and how verbally they might report to us. And we just talked about a little bit of that. But also we have to think about when they disclose, they could come forward and say, hey, guess what? Uncle Bobby has been touching me on my privates for the past 2 years. That's a direct disclosure, right? I mean, that's not the kind of disclosure you're really frequently going to get from a child in your role as a mandated reporter, but it's possible. And so we have to consider that that's what a child, how they might come forward to us, and we have to move forward with that direct statement. A child might send indirect hints out to us. I don't really like this person. I don't really like going over to their house. I have this friend who, that's another kind of indirect statement. What would you say if I told you I had this friend who had an Uncle Bobby who touched them and they didn't like it? They're just trying to see how you respond. So we want to pay attention to those indirect hints and that disguised disclosure. Disclosures with strings attached. Can I tell you a secret? If I tell you something, will you promise not to tell anybody else? You can't make those promises with kids, particularly if you're thinking, oh, you've got no idea what they're going to say, right? Because if you say, oh yeah, whatever you tell me, I can keep a secret, and then the child says, oh, my Uncle Bobby has been fondling me or touching me at night for the past 2 years, can you keep that secret? No, not as a mandated reporter, right? You have to make that report. You've got to tell them. So you can't make promises that you can't keep. So pay attention to those. If you've got a kid who comes up and says something like that, how do you respond?
Certain things have to be told as part of my job and to keep kids safe.
Yeah.
So depending on what you tell, I may have to tell.
Yeah. I really want to hear what you have to say, and I can't make promises like that because sometimes I have to tell other people what kids tell me. And it just can be a simple little statement like you just gave. If you're a therapist, your best bet is when you start off with any kind of therapy or treatment with a child that you tell them at the beginning, I just want you to know When I talk to people, I will talk to them about anything. We can talk about anything, but there are some things that when people tell me, I have to tell somebody else. So if you ever tell me that you're being hurt, that you're going to hurt somebody else, or that you're going to hurt yourself, those are times when I have to tell somebody else, because we want to make sure that we keep you safe. Those are the kinds of things that as a therapist that you should be telling people, a mental health professional, social worker, whatever. You should be telling kids whenever you work with them. Tell them that up front. If you're a teacher and some kid comes up to you with this kind of a statement, or a nurse in the school, or a counselor in the school, something else, then again, that should be kind of a, what's coming? And don't make promises. And then we also have to consider that disclosure of abuse is a process, not an event. So like I said, for that direct disclosure, it's generally not the child that we're going to have that's going to come up to us and say, hey, guess what? Uncle Bobby was touching me on my privates for the past couple of years, or did it last night. It could be that we're going to get little pieces of it, and that little pieces of it could come out over time. So it may be that you make multiple reports on what this child tells you as you interact with this child in the future. Okay, so in information gathering, here's what things that we're going to talk about, and we've got A, B, C, D, E, R. So we're going to talk about these individually, but first we want to make sure that we access a private location, we build rapport with the child once we're there. We identify the concern that we have, why we're talking to the child, discuss the facts of the abusive situation, end our conversation with the child respectfully, and then we're going to go and report the abuse. We're going to do this when we know or we have reason to believe that a child may be a victim. Again, we don't have to have proof that a child is a victim. We just have to have that reasonable suspicion. So if we think that the child is a victim of abuse or neglect, we're going to do this. And if the child has indicated that he or she is a victim, so that verbal direct report that we get. So the process here, access a private location. We don't just want to start this conversation with a child in the middle of the hallway, right? We want to go someplace where we're not going to be interrupted, where it's going to be private, and that other people aren't going to keep coming in and out, or they can't hear stuff, or that's not distracting for the child. So we want that comfortable, private environment. I worked in one school where people said, oh, we'll just go into the broom closet. That's kind of creepy, right? You want to have some place, if you're in a school, some place where you can go that's going to be a safe, private location, minimizing those distractions. Some people in schools will take the child into the principal's office. Why do kids go to the principal's office? Because they're in trouble, right? And so we have to reinforce to that child that they're not in trouble. I'm talking to you today because there's a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. I just want to let you know that you're not in any trouble with me. Okay? Consider informed consent. That's more specifically for therapists and other mental health practitioners, that they may have to tell the kids what their responsibilities are, what we just talked about. At the beginning of your therapy sessions with kids, telling them that there are limitations on the confidentiality. But you can also do that if you're a teacher or a coach or other form of mandated reporter, not in the mental health field. Just let them know, when I talk to kids, there are some things that I have to tell other people. Once you get in that safe and private location, then you need to build rapport. And so it's not just jumping right in and saying, so, hey, I think something's going on with you. Tell me about it. You've got to make that child feel comfortable. So you've got to also give that child your undivided attention. You have to be focused and listening on that child. You can't have your phones ringing off the hook and answering that while you're trying to have this conversation with somebody. So a private, uninterrupted location and unconditional acceptance. Whatever they say, it's okay. They can tell you anything. You're not going to blame them for anything. They're not going to get in trouble for anything. That concern identification, the C, we want to directly and openly state our concern or observation. So you can say to the child, you know what, you came into school yesterday and you had long sleeves on when it was really hot out, and I saw you push up your sleeves, and I saw that there were some bruises on your arms, and I'm a little bit worried about that. Tell me about what happened. So you can specifically state something that you're seeing. Or I've noticed that you're staying after school a lot, that you tell your friends you don't want to go home, you've joined all of these clubs. I'm wondering if there's something going on that makes you not want to go home. So you can specifically say what you've observed, what you've witnessed from this child as a way to start this conversation. And you want to encourage and allow the child to respond. You don't want to keep rapid firing these questions at them. Give them time to respond. You know what, and anything that you tell me in here is okay. Anything you say in here is okay. And pay attention to those verbal and nonverbal responses. If they start to kind of withdraw and kind of shrink up on themselves, if they start to cry, those are things that you might want to pay attention to. If they get angry with you, that's something that might be indicative that something's going on that they want to keep secret. So we have to pay attention to all of those things. If the child says, well, yeah, something happened, my dad hit my arm with a belt and it really hurt, and then you want to get more information. Tell me about that. So get the who, what, where, and when if possible. These are the things that we need to have to be able to report. There are some kids who aren't going to be able to tell you the when. If it happened a really long time ago, or if they're really little kids, that when might be really hard for them to pin down. You can still make a report if you have the who and the what. The where is helpful because that determines the jurisdiction. So it's like wherever the crime occurred or wherever the abuse occurred, that's the jurisdiction, the law enforcement jurisdiction, the child protection jurisdiction that they're going to want to investigate. But even if you don't have that, you can report it to wherever you are right now. They can help suss out that information and maybe move forward. You don't need to get into a lot of other details. Once you get the who and the what, maybe the where for that jurisdiction issue, maybe the when to pin it down, you don't need to keep asking for details about, so where does he keep the belt and who else does he use the belt on? You don't have to keep pushing for that because that will come from the rest of the investigation. If you keep pushing for that information, the child might not be ready, they might shut down, and it might contaminate further investigation later down the line. Excuse me. Reflect the child's sentence structure in words, so use their words. If they're using short sentences, use their sentences, their sentence structure, use short sentences. If they're talking about their privates, don't start calling it their penis or their vagina, depending on what their gender is. Call it their privates. Use their words. And even if they're weird words or words that you're uncomfortable with, if you change them, that might say to the child that you're not comfortable talking about this, and so the child might shut down. So continue to use whatever words the child uses. And then provide reassurance. If the child seems to be really hesitant or really worried about something, you can ask them about that. Tell them that they're not in any trouble with you. Tell them that you're going to do what you can to try to help this child. Tell them that you're going to have to talk to somebody else, but give them reassurance that they didn't do anything wrong. Because no matter what the situation is, if they've been abused or neglected, it's not their fault. And then we want to end respectfully. If we have any reason to believe that this child is going to be in danger if they go home after they've told us this information, we need to identify that. So we can ask the child, is it okay for you to go home today? If they're older, you can say, do you think it's safe for you to go home today? So we can ask that question. If they say no, then we need a more immediate response. It's not, I'm going to go home tonight and make this report. It's, I need to call the police or child protection right now because this kid shouldn't be going home. Reassure the child that it was a good thing to tell. It was a good idea to talk to me. You did a really good job telling me that. Thank you for telling me, but tell them in some way that it was good. Be careful not to be judgmental about that or indicate in any way that if they didn't tell before that what they did was bad, right? Because we want to reinforce for them that it was okay for them to tell now. And if we say something like, you should have told us sooner, then that's really being critical of the child, and we don't want to put that child in that situation. Let the child know what you're going to do. And if you probably told them at the beginning, if you tell me something where I have some concerns about your safety or the safety of others, I have to tell people. Well, now you can say, I told you that I might have to tell somebody, and here's who I have to tell. And tell them what you're going to do, what the next step is. And then ask the child, do you have any questions for me? And the child may be like, yeah, am I going to be able to go home? Is this person going to get in trouble? If you don't know the answer, it's okay for you to say, you know what, I don't know that. But when I call these people, I can find out that information and I can let you know. So be honest with the child. Don't make any promises that you can't keep. And let them know that if they do have questions that you don't know the answer to, that you'll find that out and try to get back with the child, or have somebody else get back with the child. Okay? And then you're reporting. You've gathered this information. You haven't done a full-fledged investigation or interview with this child. You've only gotten enough information to make your report, and so then you call that in. You call law enforcement or child protection, and remember, it's not that you have confirmed that abuse has occurred. It's just that you know or have reason to believe that abuse is suspected. And then you want to document. And document, please don't, whenever you do this, if you sit down with a child and ask them about what's going on, don't record that. Don't audio record it or video record it. But write things out when you're done. As soon as you're done talking to the child, go and take some notes and try to use the child's words. It's challenging when I was doing interviews with kids. It was challenging for us to get a report in that the child, a 5-year-old child, said that Uncle Bobby was having sexual intercourse with him. Okay, where did this word come from? We would want to know, where would a 5-year-old child learn sexual intercourse? Was that his word, or was it from somebody else? And it's helpful because that gives us information about that developmental level of the child. If they're using that word, I'm going to want to know where they learned that, how they learned that. So as much as possible, use the child's words. If the child says, forgive me everybody, but Uncle Bobby fucked me last night, well, that's a pretty good indicator too of some experience that the child has, particularly if you're talking to a 5-year-old. You want to know where that child learned that word, because it may be that that's what the perpetrator, that's what Uncle Bobby was saying to the child. It gives you a lot of information. But use the child's words, and then continue to document. Remember that kids may continue to report to you. If they've come to you the first time and you've actually listened to them and you've actually made a report or supported them in some way, then they might continue to come back to you because they think that you're a safe person now to come to. So continue to document things that the child says and continue to send those reports in to child protection. Any questions about any of that, about that process and how that works? Okay. Here's what we don't want you to do. Please, please, please don't leave the room talking to the child and immediately call the alleged perpetrator. Some people want to do that because they think, well, I just want to give them a heads up, or, I don't want to damage my relationship with this family. Don't do that. What might happen if you do that?
You might hit the child at night.
Yeah, there could be problems, and the child could be further abused at night because now they know that somebody has told that something's going on, or that the child is told that something's going on. What else could happen? The child could recant. Oh, I don't know what they're talking about. I didn't say anything. I'm sorry. If there's any evidence of any abuse, the person might destroy evidence. If there's video cameras or movies or something else, they could destroy the evidence for that. They could flee, right? So we want to make sure that we are not calling anybody else. We make this report and the investigators take it from there. And part of this is people are like, oh, I don't want them to ruin my relationship. Well, remember, under most laws, you're not going to be identified to the alleged perpetrator, who the reporter was. Admittedly, they might be able to figure it out, but it's not a guarantee. They might think it was the neighbor instead of you or something else, right? So you just don't call the alleged perpetrator. Don't tell other people and think like that situation when I was in the school and we were supposed to report to the principal and then think my responsibility is done. It doesn't work like that. You have to be the one, unless there's specific state law that says that you can have somebody who's the designated reporter. Most places, it has to be the person with first-hand knowledge. that they have to make that report. In the state of Minnesota, first-hand knowledge. But here's the kind of tricky piece to that. If you're the school nurse and the child tells you, and you come and tell me, and I say, oh, no, you are the mandated reporter, you have to tell, and you don't tell, I still now have knowledge or have reason to believe that abuse is occurring because of what you told me. I now have liability on me to make that report too, but you still haven't.
So if I answer the phone and someone's calling us because they suspect their ex-husband is sexually abusing their child, and I don't have a second to pass it off to Molly, and they're like, I know this is his name, this is where he lives, this is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a second to pass it off to Molly, but I still do. I still write them down and pass them off to Molly. Should I be reporting and Molly, or just Molly if she takes the case from there?
Technically, you have first-hand knowledge, and now you have first-hand knowledge. What I would recommend that you do is that one of you makes the report and says, and they talk to this person first. So if you call it in, they talk to you first. So you're both getting there, or you could be on the phone at the same time reporting it, but acknowledge that you both have that information. And you, at least, because you work together, you can rely on her professionalism to carry through, and if she does or doesn't, usually, I think, because of the proximity of your work environment. If she doesn't follow through, though, you still got to get it in, and then you should say, and she knows because she talked to him too, right? Rat her out, boy, rat her out. But there's that responsibility is still there for each individual who knows. I worked a case where a child, it was an adult at that point who had been sexually abused by her father, went to one jurisdiction when I was living in New York State. She went to the police there, and they said, that's not our, you're in the wrong town. You've got to go to the next town over. And she got sent over to the next town. They said, that's not us. That's this other jurisdiction. She got sent around to 4 different places. Technically, all of those people should have made a report to CPS because they all knew that she was being abused. She had told them all, and they all just kept passing her on to the next person. You don't want that to happen. Don't make a video or audio recording of your conversation with a child. I already talked about that. Don't disclose confidential information. People want to know juicy things, right? People want to know, a child, you were in that office with that child for a long time. What are you guys talking about? It's really none of your business, right? So you have to maintain that confidentiality of the child. Don't lie or make promises to the child. Don't tell them if the child says, okay, I'm really worried about this. They've just told you what might have happened. They're really scared. They're really worried. What's going to happen to Uncle Bobby now? I'm afraid he's going to get in trouble. Don't say, oh, no, he'll be fine. Right? Because you just don't know. Or if they say, I want him to go to jail for what he did for me, you can't say, well, we'll make sure that happens. Because you just have no control over that. You just don't know. So don't lie or make any promises. And one really coercive kind of a statement to make to a child, which please I ask you all to not ever do, is say to a child, if you tell me, we can make sure this never happens to you again. There's a couple of problems with that, right? Because it's the if you tell me, now we're trying to coerce the child into saying something, and then you're making a promise to a child that there is no reasonable way that you can expect to keep that, right? You can't predict if this child will ever be abused again by somebody. And if you make that kind of a promise, then you're just one more person who betrays the child if something happens again. And don't pretend as though nothing happened. You see the child in school the next day. If you're a teacher, don't just hey, how's it going, and keep walking. You might just, don't make a big deal out of it. Oh, how you doing? You don't want to do that either, but check in with the child. How you doing? Is everything okay? Is there anything else that I can do for you? Do you want to, I'm available whenever you want to talk. So just don't pretend like nothing has happened for that child. Acknowledge that this is something that the child told you, that it was really important, and that you're available to the child in the future. Any questions about the don'ts? Something else in terms of disclosing confidential information. There are some professionals who have confidentiality with regard to the work they do with clients. So if we're a therapist, for example, working with a client, When we call in a report of child abuse and we're working with a child who has a history of sexual acting out, who has a history of substance use, their family is all messed up, when you make that report, you don't have to say all of that. What you have to say is the who, the what, the where if you can get it, and the when if you can get it. Right? So you don't have to, if you have a confidential relationship with a child, you, when you make that report, can maintain a lot of that other confidentiality with, and still report that child's abuse. So that's something that to keep in mind for folks as well, that some therapists are really concerned that they're violating confidentiality, or rape crisis workers or domestic violence shelter workers. You don't have to disclose the whole file, you just talk about what's necessary to ensure the safety of the child. All right, so let's talk about some real world scenarios, and we have 10 scenarios and we're not going to cover them all in this webinar. I'll skip over some of them so the folks that are watching this can maybe have some discussions with their colleagues about how they would respond. So we'll do about 3 of them and then skip over the rest of them. So first of all, let's look at scenario number 2. Mary, who's age 4, complains to her caretaker about stomach pains as soon as she arrives at daycare. When the caretaker asks Mary to point to where it hurts, Mary pulls up her shirt and reveals bruises on her stomach and chest. The caretaker takes Mary out into the hallway for privacy and asks how she got the bruises. Mary responds, "I'm not supposed to tell," and begins crying uncontrollably. Mary refuses to respond to any additional questions. What obligations, if any, do you have under the mandatory reporter statute? You're the caretaker.
Report.
Report, yeah. Why report? What do we know?
Physical bruises.
Physical bruises on the child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we know who the alleged perpetrator is? We don't. But we've got these bruises here, and if they're on her stomach, is that the kind of a place where we normally would expect a bruise to be? No. So this is something where we can call in. When we make that call, we'll tell them, I have this child, here's her name, here's her age, here's what I observed, I asked her this question, and this is what she told me. What is that I'm not supposed to tell indicative of?
She's discussed it with someone and they told her not to disclose what happened.
Yeah, it sounds like she's actually been told, don't tell anybody about this, right? So it sounds like there might be some culpability somewhere about what's not okay to tell. If she had a bruise and it was just from, like, maybe she tripped and fell down on something that caused a bruise on her belly, would she likely have been told by a parent or a caregiver not to tell anybody about tripping? No. So we have a reasonable suspicion that this child has suffered from physical abuse. What moral obligations do you have? Are there moral obligations that you as the caretaker have with regard to this?
To reaffirm that to the child that you're going to let someone else know and that we're going to get into help so that doesn't hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, you can tell the child, you know, that you've got, and you don't have to use this word, but you've got some ethical guidelines. I have to tell somebody else about what happened. I see that you have bruises on your tummy and somebody else needs to know about that, so I have to let them know. Okay? So you might want to also ask the child then before you're done with this little, and it's a very short conversation now that you've had with this child in the hallway, let them know that you have to tell somebody, and then is it okay for you to go home? Will somebody be upset with you if you go home? Or will something happen if you go home? Those are some ways that for a 4-year-old you might want to explore, is it safe for them? But this is one of those situations where it might not be a good idea to wait 24 hours before you make that call. You might want to make that call as soon as possible, because as a 4-year-old, her impulsiveness might lead her to, when she gets home, say, I told my daycare provider Mary about my tummy, or Mary asked me about my tummy, and so that might put that child at further harm. So we need to call that in as soon as we can. Okay, let's talk about scenario number 3. Noah, age 7, received several unsatisfactory marks on his report card. On the playground the next day, Noah told his teacher that his mother was mad and gave him a whooping over his report card. The teacher asked if he hurt anywhere or had any bruises. Noah said no. The teacher observed no visible marks or bruising on Noah's exposed legs or arms, and Noah explained that his mother whoops all the kids in the family with her hand, or sometimes with the bedroom slippers when they're bad. Then he ran off to play with his friends. Was that a reportable incident?
Yes.
Yes, say why.
She used an object instead of just her hand to hit them.
Yeah.
So it's possible she's used other objects.
It's possible, yeah. What about, does anybody think that it's not reportable? Under the Minnesota statute, at least.
The open, or the hand and the no marks type of thing, without the object.
Yeah. So technically, from what she reports, and if it's bedroom slippers, now there's a couple of things that we might want to know. If they're like those soft, fuzzy bedroom slippers, that's one thing. If they're like the 4-inch heel, spiky bedroom slippers, and she's hitting with the heel, that's a different thing, right? So we might ask a few more questions about the bedroom slippers, or what else kids get in trouble about, or what else they get whoopings about. And so you could go back to the child at another time. You don't have to say, hey, come back here, you can't play right now. But just at another time when you have an opportunity, ask a few more questions. Who else gets in trouble at your house? What else do they get in trouble for? If it's for things that seem reasonable, like the report card or other kind of traditional things that kids get in trouble for and get spankings for, that's something we want to maybe know a little bit more about. And what other things? You said that mommy sometimes hits you with her hand and sometimes with the bedroom slippers. Tell me about the bedroom slippers. Get a little bit more information about that. Does she hit you sometimes with something other than her hand or other than the bedroom slippers? You can get a little bit more about that. But if it's just the hand and it's these big, fluffy, nice, soft bedroom slippers and it's just for like when kids are in trouble, that could be a traditionally accepted form of physical punishment for kids. Some people might argue your moral obligation is different, right? Because if you don't have a chance to gather all of that information or the child won't talk to you anymore, you still might have some reasonable suspicion, or you could be of the position that kids should never be spanked anyway, and if they're being spanked with this, they might be being spanked with something else. I think somebody should check it out. Then you might have that moral obligation to make that call. Okay? So there's some touchy ones, and sometimes you might want to chat with a colleague without disclosing confidential information about the child. I'm a little bit concerned about this. Let's talk it out a little bit. My position for people is if you're on the fence about something, call it in and they'll screen it out if they don't think it fits the criteria. When I say they, I mean CPS. Okay, we're going to skip forward then to number 8. While at a block party in your neighborhood, you observe one of your neighbor's preschool children has bruises on her inner thighs and behind her knees. When the child reaches up to get a brownie, the back of her shirt raises and you see bruises along her lower vertebrae. You ask her how she got her owies. Her mother interrupts you saying, "What are you going to do, make a mountain out of a molehill?" And then she leaves with her child. So, first of all, if you're at a block party in your neighborhood, and this is going to vary depending on what state you're in, are you a mandated reporter? For the state of Minnesota? No. You're not a mandated reporter in this kind of a situation. So what obligation do you have under the mandated reporter statute to make a report? None. You have no obligation whatsoever. So in the state of Minnesota, this wouldn't require you to make a report. There are other states where everybody is a mandated reporter. Anybody who suspects or has reason to believe that a child may be being abused must report. If you're in one of those states, then you have to report. You have a legal obligation. In this situation, do you have a moral or an ethical obligation to report if you're not a mandated reporter? I would argue yes, right? Because what are you seeing? You're seeing bruises, and you're seeing bruises where? on their back, which is not a normal place that a child would get in terms of like normal play, rough and tumble kinds of things. And with the mom's response, that's a little bit concerning as well, right? So I would argue that there is a moral or an ethical obligation for people, even if they're not mandated to report, that this be a call that goes in. And once again, it's not our job to gather all of the information and get all the details. And it might be that CPS says this isn't enough for me to go on. But then that's for them to make that call. That's their decision. We can make that initial report. The other thing is that they could have gotten a call 10 minutes before that said, the neighbor to this very family, I saw this mom hitting this kid, right? So, oh, hello, let's put those two things together. We have somebody saying they saw the mom hitting a kid, and now we see that there are bruises on this child. That's problematic. So it could be that there's a cumulative effect. Even if you don't think that there's enough to go on with your own information, there could be a cumulative effect of these kind of reports going in. Now that's likely to happen in a smaller jurisdiction as opposed to a big city, but that's something to keep in mind.
Aren't some licensed professionals obligated off the clock too?
That's the thing where it depends on the state. In Minnesota, if you're a licensed professional and you're off the clock, it doesn't say anything about that. There are some states that specifically state only when you're acting in your formal duties. And then other states say you're always a mandated reporter, and other states say everybody's always a mandated reporter. So it depends on the state. Yep. Okay. So just let's look at the moral obligation. Can that create a legal obligation for mandated reporters? Consider whether there's a Good Samaritan law in your state. Virtually all states have some form of a Good Samaritan law, and it could create an obligation for all citizens to make a report if you have reason to believe child abuse has happened. In Minnesota, this is our Good Samaritan statute. I won't read that to you, but just look to see, find out, or you can contact me to find out what that Good Samaritan statute is in your state. Particularly if not all people are obligated to report, this might be an issue for you. And so maybe there's not a legal obligation as a mandated reporter, but by virtue of a Good Samaritan statute, you might have a moral obligation to report. Okay. Here are some resources that are available to folks. The Child Welfare Information Gateway has a lot of information on signs and symptoms of abuse. That's also the resource for the mandated reporting summaries of all the statutes. Child Help is a great source for information. And then if you don't know who to call in your jurisdiction, you can give me a call and we can let you know that. Or you can contact the National Child Abuse Hotline for a Child, and they'll redirect you to wherever you need to go. A couple of other resources: the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Prevent Child Abuse America, the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families has good definitions too out there on child abuse. And then last but not least, the National Child Protection Training Center, which is our facility here. We're available to help out when you have any questions or concerns about child abuse. We're happy to help. And thank you for participating in this webinar. We appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks.